Hello! So, the Dawntrail job changes are out now, thank goodness. I was honestly going a little stir-crazy waiting for them. I assume by now you've seen most, if not all, of the new tooltips, so I'm not going to waste your time rehashing every little change that's happened. If you haven't seen them for some reason, many Final Fantasy XIV YouTubers have covered the changes, and I'll just highlight Renon, Whoops, and Miztech as being the ones I used. No, instead I want to give my thoughts on these changes and talk about how impactful they're going to be for the jobs in question. Which jobs will feel largely the same, and which jobs will feel slightly or significantly different. To aid with this, I've created this handy little tier list. At the top we have the new jobs, Viper and Pictomancer, because they're new jobs, who would have thought they'd be new. Next here we have jobs that had some significant changes. Note that I'm not talking about the amount of new buttons or new gauges or whatever, but the jobs that have the most significantly different feel from their current incarnations. One step below that we have jobs with slight changes. These are jobs that received a couple of nice quality of life features but did not change in any significant way. It will be slightly easier or nicer to play them, but the job on the whole will remain the same. Finally, we have our last category. These are jobs that received 1 or 2 new damage buttons to press, but basically nothing else. The job will play almost exactly the same as current. Also, a quick addendum before we begin. I won't be covering Viper or Pictomancer in this video. If you're curious about those two jobs, my pre-release videos covering them are basically 100% accurate to the finished versions of these jobs. The only bits I missed were Viper's positionals and the way Pictomancer's shield works. Again, the people I gave a shout out to above have more detailed breakdowns, but if you want a quick overview, my other videos will serve you just fine. Alright, let's get started. Paladin and Warrior are up first because they received largely the same changes. Both received a slightly souped up mitigation and the new off-global cooldown to press during their big burst. Paladin received some new animation upgrades, and Warrior received the GCD to use once a minute, but ultimately these change nothing about how these jobs play. They're just more potency. These jobs are functionally identical to their current incarnations. Dark Knight received a few more changes. In addition to the new big damage button, some new animation upgrades, and a souped up mitigation, the job also received some quality of life changes. Esteem no longer costs gauge, and the job's gap closer no longer does damage. Blood Weapon and Delirium have also been combined to keep things more simple. This means that the opener and burst phases are going to be less busy than they currently are, landing this in the mild changes tier. These are changes I'm honestly really ambivalent about. I'm always going to be a fan of non-damaging gap closers, and I don't feel the job's identity is significantly harmed by having a few less off-global cooldowns to hit during burst. However, I do understand people who are more upset by it, and I worry that these changes are going to make the job feel even more simple than it already is. Gunbreaker is in a similar boat. The souped up mitigation is cool, and the AoE continuation is a long time coming, but those aren't the real changes. The real change is the removal of damage from gap closers and the new 3-hit combo that happens during 2-minute bursts, which, importantly, does not have any continuation actions. These two changes mean that Gunbreaker burst windows are going to be significantly less weave heavy. They removed almost half of the weaves from the 2-minute burst. This change is emblematic of the tension that exists at the center of Gunbreaker. Gunbreaker is a tank that plays like a DPS. A tank generally wants fewer weaves so that it has time to fit in mitigations if it needs to. A DPS wants a ton of weaves to keep the job feeling fast and interesting. These two priorities conflict with each other, and there isn't a good way to solve them. These changes serve to move the job much closer to a traditional tank, making it much easier to do main tank things, but reducing the action-packed nature of the job. Overall, I would call this a fairly significant change, and it's one I'm very torn on. I can understand both sides' opinion on this change, and I want to see it in action before I formulate a strong opinion. Now, on to the healers, and White Mage. White Mage got only a few changes, but they are frankly so cool. First is an AoE heal upgrade that frankly doesn't matter. All of the healers got this change, and while it is cool and will help these jobs, it's not really affecting gameplay in any meaningful way, so I won't be mentioning it for the rest of the jobs. White Mage also got a big new heal button to use after using wings, which is pretty cool, but not the main reason I'm hyped. The big changes are the addition of a pretty respectable dash and 3 new instant casts to use during 2-minute bursts. White Mage has always been a job that's been pretty immobile, especially during 2-minute burst, because the faster GCD means you spend way more time casting and have less time for movement. These changes give the job a lot more mobility, both during burst and in general, and I'm very excited for it. Scholar also received some small changes. First is a new big heal that I love the design of. This is an OGCD that has an immediate regen and buffs the healing output of all of Scholar's GCDs. That means that this button can massively save you if you need to spam GCD heals, but also has uses if you want to avoid using GCDs to keep up damage. It's a flexible, useful button that's really well designed and I love it. Adding OGCD uses to GCD buff healing cooldowns is actually something of a theme for healers with this expansion. White Mage's new big heal comes from an ability that buffs GCDs, for instance. The other big change that Scholar got was a reduced recast time for recitation. Cards on the table, I don't really like Scholar that much, and the reason I don't like it is because, in order to do optimal DPS, you need to feed your Aetherflow stacks into energy drain instead of spending them on cool healing abilities. Recitation is a factor of the job that I really enjoy because it allows me to use some of those Aetherflow healing resources anyway, which is fun. And this change lets me do that more often, so I'm all for it. However, if I can be impartial, this change isn't really going to affect the job on a significant level. Now, Astro was the subject of a mini rework this expansion. Specifically, the Astro card system was changed significantly. However, outside of that, the job hasn't really changed that much. Neutral Sect got a new off-global cooldown healing follow-up, another off-global cooldown heal that comes from a GCD heal buffing ability, and Divination has a new damage follow-up. No, the real change was the changes to the cards. Instead of it being random, every minute you get a selection of cards that are always the same. One is damage, one is a heal, and one is defensive. During 2-minute bursts, you also gain Lord for damage. This change is great. It gives the cards their unique identity, while eliminating a lot of the randomness that has plagued Minor Arcana for a long time. I know some dedicated Astro mains are upset by this, and I do understand that. The job is losing a lot of its frantic energy, but I'm ultimately positive on this change because I value the unique card identity higher than the lost complexity of the many weaves. Finally, Sage. Sage got a flexible new healing button that can provide healing while dealing damage, or increase healing when using healing GCDs. The job also got a new damage button that you hit once every 60 seconds, nothing super revolutionary. However, the most impactful change the job received was actually fairly unassuming. Sage got a new AoE dot, very useful in AoE situations, but people quickly realized that it was actually a damage gain in single target. Now, this is extremely cool. Healers have been begging for more complex DPS rotations for years, and a job getting a new dot that they need to upkeep, and one that can only be applied in melee no less, is very, very awesome. But, I'm gonna be real with you, Chief, this change is almost certainly not going to make it to live, and if it does, it's going to be rolled back by the time that Savage gets out. Potencies tend to be a little funky around the media tour period, so I'm expecting that this change will be ironed out quickly once it's discovered. That being said, I think that would be a tragedy and I hope it stays. Regardless, if the change stands the test of time, Sage goes in major changes, but if it doesn't, it goes in minor. Now, onto the DPS. First we have Dragoon. Dragoon actually received quite a few changes. First, Spine Shatter Dive and Dragon Sight are now gone, and in their place we have 2 new off-global cooldown follow-ups. This means that burst phases should have the same number of weaves as they currently do, just in a slightly different order. The 5th hit of your combo is replaced with a new attack that doesn't require a positional, lessening the positional requirements of the job. Eyes are no longer required to enter Life of the Dragon. Instead, your Skogul just does it every time, and the cooldown has been increased to 60 seconds. Inside Life of the Dragon, you now have a passive 15% damage buff, and Nastron has been changed to work on charges, instead of having a meaningful cooldown. Also, the job has a non-damaging gap closer now, thank God. I love mobility so much. Overall, these changes seem really nice. A lot of the pain points of the job have been smoothed out, and rotations have been made smoother without sacrificing any of the core spirit of the job. Also, new gap closer, yay! This is one of the jobs I'm most excited for in the new expansion. Monk's changes are more compact. They received a couple new GCD damage follow-ups, a new follow-up to its personal mitigation, and some new animation upgrades, but the main change is actually Monk's main GCDs. Instead of being buffs and debuffs, the job now has a gauge to manage. Its GCD skills that were once buffs now grant pips, which are consumed by damaging skills. This may seem like a big change, but the standard rotation actually remains completely the same. Now, Monk mains have been pretty upset about this change, and on the surface I can see why. What this change does is kill a lot of non-standard Monk tech. This is honestly a pretty sad change, as it reduces the job's various possibilities in favor of streamlining. However, I took a quick peek at the Monk Lounge and the balance, and this isn't what monks are mostly complaining about. Instead, it seems to be focused on how the job is, quote, dumbed down, and frankly, I'm not sure I get this one at all. Like, yes, information is being presented more simply, and there are now guiders on abilities, but Dragoon has had guiders since its inception, and that job is doing just fine. Guiders aren't a signal of the end times because once you get good at a job, you generally stop needing them, because your attention should be focused on other places. This change serves only to help new players learn the job, and that seems great to me, frankly. If you're a monk main who's upset about these changes, please tell me in the comments. I'm genuinely very curious about your input. Ninja seemingly got a lot of changes, but if you look closer, a lot of them are fairly superficial. Huton is now innate, and the job has a new gauge, but the new gauge leads you to pressing the same buttons in the same order, 1 armor crush for every 2 Aeolian edges. The gauge just gives you slightly more flexibility on when you need to press your buttons. Beyond that, Trick Attack now hits an AoE with an animation upgrade, Mug got an animation upgrade, your Gauge Spenders got conditional animation upgrades, and Tenchi Jin got an OGCD follow-up. Ultimately, none of that is really shifting Ninja's rotation at all, and the additional gauge only serves to reinforce Ninja's current rotation while reducing the need for timer management. Samurai's changes are somewhat inverted from Ninja, in that they seem small but actually have a surprising impact. Midare got more important, giving conditional damage buffs to your big attacks. Tsubame also got fused with Midare, meaning you only need to manage 1 cooldown instead of 2, but unfortunately restricts rotations significantly, basically eliminating a lot of incomplete combo tech. Ikishoten, your big gauge spender, now also has a follow-up that consumes the gauge you generate, so okay I guess. Sene now has a shortened cooldown, but consumes the same amount of gauge as a normal Shinten, so it's not significantly impacting your gameplay. Finally, Third Eye got a buff, making your personal mitigation a bit stronger. Oh, also Shoha 1 and 2 were combined, thank God. Ultimately, these changes made the job more restrictive in exchange for reducing cooldown management by a small amount, and I'm not sure if that's the best trade-off in the world. I'm not a samurai main, so I don't want to take a firm stance here, but as an outsider, these aren't changes I'm thrilled about for the mains, even if I'm personally very glad I don't have to manage Midare and Tsubame's cooldowns separately. Reaper is one of the jobs that changed the least. It got some conditional animation upgrades for its blue gauge generators, a new off-global cooldown to press during Shroud phase, and a new big finisher button to press during 2-minute bursts. And that's all, folks. No new utility, no changes in the rotation at all, basically just exactly the same as before. Technically, the new finisher Perfectio is ranged, which you could call some form of utility, but let's be honest with ourselves, it's not the most impactful thing in the world now, is it? On to the ranged physicals, and we'll start with Bard. Bard got a new finisher for Barrage, a new finisher for Radiant Finale, a new animation upgrade for Bloodletter, some combined procs, and yeah, whatever, who cares. The real change, the true change, the most important change, is that you can play songs without needing a target. Finally! Oh my god, this is amazing. 10 out of 10. Realistically, this is a nice quality of life feature, but won't be significantly changing any rotations for the job. Machinist also got fairly minimal changes. Despite how flashy Full Metal Machinist is, it's just another 2-minute burst finisher. The job also got animation upgrades for a heat window, which are very cool but not really changing anything. The real biggest change is that Drill is getting a second charge. Machinist is a job that requires you to hit your 3 main GCDs the second they come off cooldown, and any missed timings causes them to drift, which can cause problems in your rotations. Charges significantly reduce the precision required to play the job, which I'm all in favor of. I hope the other big GCDs get charges down the line. Finally, Dancer. Dancer got 3 new finishers, after using Tech Step, Flourish, and the Flourish finisher. The weirdest Dancer change is actually very small. The general potency of actions has increased, and surprisingly, they've increased to the point where it's actually DPS efficient to avoid using Standard Step as much as possible. See what I mean about weird potencies? Dancer mains are currently planning on using their new finisher that maintains the Standard Step buff and avoid using Standard Step altogether, but I guarantee you this is just an artifact of the weird potency changes, and it will get patched quickly. With that in mind, these are fairly minimal changes. Now, casters. Summoner got an animation upgrade for Fester and a finisher for Searing Light. The job also got an entirely new summon that works the same way as every other big summon. Honestly, I saw a lot of people disappointed by this change, wanting something more for the job, and I think that's kind of missing the point. Summoner is extremely simple on purpose, because Summoner isn't for the hardcore player who wants to optimize and look up a guide. Summoner is a job for very casual players who want to hit buttons and be successful, and that's a massive part of the player base. If you go check FF logs and look at the parses for non-savage fights, aka the gameplay most players do, Summoner is the most popular job by far. Summoner is a job for those players. It succeeds very well at its role, and honestly, I think that's kind of a good thing. There should be a job in the game for people who don't want to deal with complex rotations, who just want to be able to zone out and press buttons, and making the job more complex would destroy that. It's a shame that old Summoner died so this new Summoner could be born, and most jobs in the game should not be as simple as Summoner, but the job is succeeding at its purpose quite well, and these changes support that. Next, Red Mage. Red Mage got a new off-global cooldown finisher for both its party buff and its normal finishing combo, as well as some animation upgrades for Jolt. The biggest change is that Acceleration now grants the use of Grand Impact, a new instant cast damage button. This causes problems. See, Red Mage has these little off-global cooldowns with low cooldown and no charges. A big part of high-level Red Mage gameplay is using Swift Cast and Acceleration to manipulate dual cast to make sure you always have the ability to weave when the 2 off-global cooldowns come off cooldown. These abilities traditionally have the effect of swapping the buttons you're dual casting on until you use their next melee combo. However, because Acceleration now gives 2 instant casts, it loses this property, which means Acceleration needs to be used much closer to the actual abilities coming off cooldown to have the desired effect. This isn't an end-of-the-world change, nor is it particularly large, but it is something that's going to affect the gameplay experiences of many players, and it's worth mentioning. That being said, I'm generally excited for this change because it gives the job more movement, and I end up needing to use Acceleration reactively anyway, so I'm not losing much. And finally, our true finale, the big boy, Black Mage. The Black Mage changes have caused quite a stir in the Black Mage community, and I can see why, but let's hold off on the controversy for a second and talk about the unambiguously positive changes. The ability to move ley lines is very nice. It's an amazing safety net that should mean that Black Mages get hammered less frequently. Mana Font is now a full refresh, which is awesome. The ability now feels like it deserves its 2-minute cooldown. The ability to hold 3 Polyglot stacks is here, I guess. Also, I'm going to say it. I'm glad Sharpcast is dead. That thing was annoying as hell. However, the rest of these changes are, well, let's lightning round through them real fast. Paradox can now only be used in Fire Phase. Ice Phase no longer gives meaningful mana regeneration. Ice spells, including Umbral Soul, need to be used to restore mana. Fire Paradox is now instant cast, and guarantees a Fire 3 proc. Thunder can only be used once per elemental shift. The job has a new finisher that requires you to use 6 Fire 4s in a single Fire Phase. These changes serve the purpose of very specifically killing every non-standard rotation the developers could think of. Paradox rotation is dead, rest in peace. These changes even removed little things, like you used to be able to pack 4 Fire 4s into the back half of your Fire Phase after Paradox. However, that was reliant on Paradox refreshing stance at the end of its cast. Now that it's instant, it refreshes stance too early, which means you can only use 3 Fire 4s before you need to refresh stance. The developers do not want you deviating in any way. You will use the rotation they want you to. These changes also ended up feeling somewhat hasty, and left some unfortunate gaps. Umbral Soul is the only non-targeting ice spell that Black Mage has, and you only get it at level 76. That means that, without a target, Black Mages cannot restore mana at all, heavily screwing them over in content like Ukab and Uwu, which sucks hard. These changes come across like the devs were hastily trying to stamp out non-standard rotations and not thinking through the consequences of doing so. I definitely don't think that's the case. These changes were considered, but that's the vibe these changes are giving off. That being said, if you're a Black Mage player who only plays standard rotation and doesn't plan on doing older content, these changes are actually nice. Black Mage now has more instant cast spells to pull from in Fire Phase, and the reduced number of GCDs means you can cycle between stances even faster and get your big finishers even quicker. As someone who has never touched Paradox rotation in my life, these changes seem fun, and I have friends who are excited to play Black Mage after seeing these changes. It's just that those conveniences come at the cost of a lot of the interesting things Black Mages were doing at high level play, and that's honestly really sad. I hope theory crafters find new, interesting tech to perform, and the job doesn't stagnate. And that's the tier list. A reminder that this is a tier list of how much these jobs changed, not by how good I think these changes are overall. I'm very excited to see how things develop in the first few months of Dawntrail, and I hope you'll join me in praying that the new jobs are fun, the new gear is sick, and that Sage Dot remains a damage gain in single target. Once Dawntrail comes out, I plan to start doing guides for the jobs as I level them, as well as longer video essays on the jobs and my in-depth thoughts on them. If any of that sounds interesting, please stay tuned. For now, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Also, quick addendum before we begin, I won't become a...